It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of the city, the kind of day where the sun hung lazily in the sky and the streets buzzed with the usual rhythm of life. But for Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a 72-year-old grandmother with a heart as warm as the summer air, this day would take a turn she never could have imagined. Evelyn was known in her neighborhood as the woman who always had a kind word and a plate of cookies ready for anyone who needed it. She had lived in the same house for over 40 years, raised her children there, and now spent her days tending to her garden and volunteering at the local community center. But on this particular day, as she walked home from the grocery store, her life would intersect with a moment that would change everything. Evelyn was just a block away from her house when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Confused, she pulled over, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She hadn't been speeding. She never did. She always drove carefully, especially since her arthritis had started acting up. But as the police officer approached, her car, his expression stern and unyielding, Evelyn felt a knot form in her stomach. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. Evelyn's heart raced as she slowly opened the door, her mind racing to figure out what she could have possibly done wrong. She had always respected the law, always taught her children to do the same. But as she stood there on the sidewalk, the officer began questioning her in a way that made her feel small, insignificant, and worst of all, targeted. The officer's tone was accusatory, his questions rapid-fire and confusing. He asked if she had stolen the car, if she had any drugs or weapons, if she was in the country illegally. Evelyn, bewildered and hurt, tried to explain that the car was hers, that she had just been to the store, that she was a retired teacher who had spent her life serving her community. But the officer wasn't listening. He continued to press her, his voice growing louder, his demeanor more aggressive. Passers-by began to stop and stare, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Evelyn felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She had never been treated like this before, never felt so powerless. But then something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else make her feel less than she was. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The officer sneered, "Who are you calling? Your lawyer?" Evelyn looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady despite the fear and anger coursing through her veins. "No," she said, "I'm calling my son." The officer laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound, but as Evelyn dialed the number and put the phone to her ear, there was a shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. The person on the other end of the line answered, and Evelyn spoke quietly, her words measured but firm. "Marcus," she said, "I need your help." There was a pause, and then the officer's radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was urgent, almost panicked. The officer's face went pale as he listened, his eyes darting to Evelyn, then back to his radio. He took a step back, his bravado crumbling in an instant. Evelyn stood tall, her phone still in her hand, as the officer stammered an apology. But it was too late. The wheels had already been set in motion, because Evelyn's son, the man she had just called, wasn't just any ordinary person. He was Marcus Carter, the United States Attorney General, one of the most powerful figures in the country, and he wasn't about to let his mother be treated this way. As Evelyn hung up the phone, she could see the fear in the officer's eyes, the realization dawning on him that he had just made a very big mistake. But this wasn't just about one officer or one incident. This was about something much bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. And as Evelyn stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, she knew that this was only the beginning. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their whispers growing louder as the news spread. Who was this elderly woman? Why had the officer treated her this way? And what was going to happen next? Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind racing, with thoughts of what this moment could mean, not just for her, but for her community, for her country. She had always believed in justice, in fairness, in doing the right thing. But now she was about to be thrust into the center of a storm that would challenge everything she thought she knew. As the officer tried to backtrack, tried to explain himself, Evelyn remained silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon, because she knew that this wasn't just her story anymore. It was a story about power, about accountability, about the kind of world we want to live in. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Evelyn Carter stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. But what that would be, not even she could have predicted. The officer's radio continued to crackle, the voices on the other end growing more frantic with each passing second. Evelyn could hear snippets of the conversation, words like "stand down" and "immediate response" cutting through the static. The officer, who had been so confident just moments ago, now looked like a man who had stepped into a trap he couldn't escape. His partner, who had been standing by the patrol car, quickly approached, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. The first officer didn't answer. He just stared at Evelyn, his mouth slightly open, as if he were trying to piece together how this ordinary-looking woman had suddenly turned his world upside down. Evelyn, for her part, remained calm. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who believed in facing challenges with dignity and grace. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small because of the color of their skin, their age, or their circumstances. It was about every time someone had been treated unfairly, dismissed, or disrespected. And as she stood there, surrounded by the growing crowd, she felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Meanwhile, miles away in Washington, D.C., Marcus Carter was already in motion. The moment he had heard his mother's voice on the phone, calm but firm, he had known something was terribly wrong. Marcus had always been close to his mother. She was the one who had taught him the value of hard work, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the power of using his voice to make a difference. She had been his rock, his guiding light, and now, hearing the strain in her voice, he felt a surge of anger and determination. He had worked his entire career to fight for justice, to hold people accountable, and now his own mother was the one who needed his help. Marcus quickly gathered his team, his voice sharp and commanding as he issued orders. "I want every detail of this incident," he said. "I want to know who was involved, what was said, and why my mother was targeted, and I want it now." His staff moved quickly, their usual efficiency heightened by the urgency in their boss's voice. Within minutes, they had pulled up the dashcam footage from the patrol car, accessed the officer's records, and begun reaching out to local authorities. But Marcus wasn't just relying on his team. He knew that this was bigger than just one incident. This was about a system that had failed, a pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed, and he wasn't going to stop until he got answers. Back on the street, the crowd had grown larger, their murmurs turning into shouts of support. For Evelyn, someone had started recording the scene on their phone, and within minutes, the video was already spreading on social media. The hashtag Justice for Evelyn began trending, with people from all over the country sharing their own stories of being harassed or mistreated by law enforcement. Evelyn, still standing tall despite the chaos around her, could feel the energy of the crowd, their anger and frustration mirroring her own. But she also felt something else, hope. Hope that this moment, as painful as it was, could be the start of something better. The officers, meanwhile, were clearly out of their depth. The first officer, the one who had initiated the stop, was now on the phone with his supervisor, his voice shaky as he tried to explain what had happened. His partner was trying to disperse the crowd, but it was no use. The people had seen enough and they weren't going anywhere. "Ma'am," the first officer said, turning back to Evelyn, his tone now pleading. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you could just come down to the station with us, we can sort this out." Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable. She knew what he was trying to do, diffuse the situation, save face, but she wasn't about to let him off that easily. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, "not until my son gets here." The mention of her son seemed to send a fresh wave of panic through the officers. They exchanged a glance, their fear palpable. They had no idea who Evelyn's son was, but they could tell from the way she spoke, from the way the crowd reacted, that he was someone important, and they were right. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, but these weren't the usual police sirens. These were deeper, more urgent, and as the vehicles came into view, it became clear that this was no ordinary response team. Black SUVs with government plates pulled up, their doors opening to reveal men and women in suits, their expressions serious and focused. At the center of it all was Marcus Carter, his presence commanding as he stepped out of the lead vehicle and made his way toward his mother. The crowd parted as Marcus approached, their voices rising in a mix of awe and excitement. Evelyn felt a surge of pride as she watched her son, the boy she had raised to be kind, to be strong, to fight for what was right, now standing tall as one of the most powerful men in the country. But there was no time for sentiment. Marcus's face was set in a hard line, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on his mother. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. Evelyn nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I'm fine," she said, "but we need to talk." Marcus turned to the officers, his expression hardening. "I want everyone involved in this incident detained for questioning," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "And I want a full investigation into what happened here today." The officers looked stunned, but they didn't argue. They knew better. As they were led away, Marcus turned back to his mother, his expression softening. "Let's get you home," he said. But Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "There's something you need to see." She led him to her car, where she opened the trunk and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Marcus recognized it immediately. It was the same notebook she had used for years to jot down her thoughts, her ideas, her memories. But as she handed it to him, he realized it was more than just a notebook. It was a record, a detailed account of every time she had been stopped, questioned, or harassed by law enforcement over the years. There were dates, times, locations, and descriptions of each incident, written in Evelyn's careful handwriting. Marcus flipped through the pages, his heart growing heavier with each one. He had known, of course, that his mother had faced challenges, but seeing it all laid out like this, in black and white, was something else entirely. "This isn't just about me," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is about everyone who's ever been treated this way, everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't matter. You have the power to do something about this, Marcus, and I need you to use it." Marcus looked at his mother, his mind racing. He had always known she was strong, but this was something else. She wasn't just asking him to help her. She was asking him to take on a system that had failed too many people for too long. And as he stood there, holding that notebook in his hands, he knew she was right. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about justice, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. But as Marcus and Evelyn stood there, surrounded by the crowd and the flashing lights, they both knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles. But they also knew that they weren't alone. the people around them, the voices rising in support, the stories being shared. They were all part of something bigger. And as the night deepened, the air thick with tension and possibility, one thing was clear. This was a moment that would change everything. But how and for whom remained to be seen. As Marcus and Evelyn stood together on the quiet street, now illuminated by the harsh glow of floodlights from the government vehicles, the weight of the moment pressed down on them both. The crowd had grown even larger, their voices a mix of anger, hope, and curiosity. News vans were beginning to arrive, their cameras trained on the scene, and reporters were already shouting questions, trying to piece together what had happened. Marcus knew that this story was about to explode, and he needed to act quickly, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. He turned to one of his aides, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, and said, "Get me everything you can on these officers. I want their records, their history, any complaints filed against them, and I want to know who gave the order for this stop." Lisa nodded and immediately began typing on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. Evelyn, meanwhile, was surrounded by a small group of neighbors and community members who had come to support her. They brought her water, offered her a chair, and tried to shield her from the chaos. But Evelyn wasn't interested in sitting down. She was focused on her son, on the way he carried himself with such authority, and on the way the officers who had harassed her were now being led away, their faces pale and their hands cuffed. It was a strange reversal, one that should have felt like justice, but Evelyn couldn't shake the unease in her chest. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been treated the same way, or worse, and had no one to call, no one to fight for them. She knew Marcus would do everything in his power to make this right, but she also knew that the system they were up against was deeply entrenched, with roots that ran far deeper than one incident. As the night wore on, Marcus's team worked tirelessly, pulling together information and piecing together the timeline of events. What they found was troubling. The officer who had stopped Evelyn, a man named Officer Daniels, had a history of complaints against him, allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and unprofessional conduct. But despite these red flags, he had been allowed to remain on the force, his record seemingly swept under the rug. Marcus felt a surge of anger as he read through the files. This wasn't just about one bad apple. It was about a system that protected its own, even when they were in the wrong, and it was about the people who suffered because of it. But Marcus also knew that he couldn't act on emotion alone. He needed evidence, and he needed to follow the proper channels. He called a press conference for the following morning, knowing that the eyes of the nation would be on him. He wanted to send a clear message. This wasn't just about his mother, it was about accountability, transparency, and justice for all. As he prepared his statement, he couldn't help but think about the stories his mother had shared with him. Over the years, stories of her own struggles, of the friends and neighbors who had faced similar treatment, of the fear and frustration that came with being targeted simply because of who you were. Those stories had shaped him, had driven him to pursue a career in law, and now they were fueling his determination to make a difference. While Marcus was focused on the bigger picture, Evelyn was thinking about the smaller, more personal details. She thought about the way Officer Daniels had looked at her, the way his voice had dripped with disdain, and the way he had dismissed her when she tried to explain herself. She thought about the fear she had felt, not just for herself, but for her son, for her community, for the world she wanted to leave behind. And she thought about the notebook she had given Marcus, the one filled with years of pain and frustration. She hoped it would be enough to make people understand, to make them see that this wasn't just one isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a system that needed to change. As the night deepened, the tension in the air grew thicker. The officers involved in the incident were being held for questioning, but Marcus knew that their lawyers would be working overtime to try to spin the narrative. He also knew that there were powerful forces at play, people who would do whatever it took to protect their own, but he wasn't going to back down. He had the truth on his side, and he had the support of the people. And most importantly, he had his mother, whose quiet strength and unwavering resolve had always been his guiding light. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a young man named Jamal was watching the news coverage of the incident with a mix of anger and hope. Jamal had been stopped by police more times than he could count, and he knew firsthand what it felt like to be treated like a criminal just because of the color of his skin. He had always felt powerless, like there was nothing he could do to change the system. But seeing Evelyn stand up to the officers, seeing Marcus step in and demand justice, gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. Maybe this was the moment when things would finally begin to change, but not everyone was hopeful. In a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, a group of off-duty officers were watching the same news coverage, their faces grim. They knew what was coming, the scrutiny, the backlash, the calls for reform, and they weren't happy about it. "This is bull," one of them muttered, slamming his beer bottle down on the table. "We're out here risking our lives every day, and this is the thanks we get?" The others nodded in agreement, their frustration palpable. They felt like they were under attack, like the world was turning against them. And they weren't about to go down without a fight. As the night stretched on, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The incident had sparked a fire, one that was spreading quickly, fueled by years of pent-up anger and frustration. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. And as Marcus and Evelyn stood together, watching the sun rise over the city they both loved, they knew that they were ready to face whatever came next. But what that would be, no one could say. The morning sun rose over the city, casting a golden glow on the streets that had been filled with tension just hours before. But the calm was deceptive. The city was a powder keg, and the spark had already been lit. Marcus Carter stood at the podium in front of City Hall, his face stern but composed, as reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. Behind him, a row of local leaders and activists stood in solidarity, their presence a silent reminder that this wasn't just about one family, it was about an entire community. Evelyn stood to the side, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm but resolute. She had always been a private person, someone who shied away from the spotlight, but today she knew she had to be visible. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt the weight of injustice. Marcus began his statement, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of urgency. "What happened to my mother yesterday is not an isolated incident," he said, his words echoing through the crowd. "It is part of a pattern, a system that has failed too many people for too long. But today we are here to demand accountability. We are here to demand change." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in a chorus of support. But Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. As the press conference continued, the officers involved in the incident were being questioned. At the police station, Officer Daniels sat in a small, windowless room, his hands resting on the table in front of him. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a cold demeanor, sat beside him, whispering instructions. Daniel's face was pale, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. He knew he was in trouble, but he also knew that the system had protected him before. He just had to stick to the script, to play the part of the overworked officer who had made a mistake. But deep down, he couldn't shake the image of Evelyn standing tall, her phone in her hand, calling her son. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jamal was organizing a rally. He'd spent the night reaching out to friends, neighbors, and community leaders, spreading the word about what had happened to Evelyn. The response had been overwhelming. People were angry, but they were also hopeful. For the first time in a long time, they felt like someone in power was listening. Jamal stood on a makeshift stage, his voice ringing out over the crowd. "This is our moment," he said, his words filled with passion. "This is our chance to stand up and say enough is enough. We deserve better. Our children deserve better, and we're not going to stop until we get it." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in unison, a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from standing together. But not everyone was on board. In a dimly lit office at the police union headquarters, a group of high-ranking officials were meeting in secret. They knew that the incident with Evelyn had the potential to blow up in their faces, and they were determined to control the narrative. "We need to push back," one of them said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let them paint us as the bad guys. We need to remind people of the risks we take, the sacrifices we make." The others nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They had been through this before, and they knew how to play the game. But this time, they were up against someone who knew the system just as well as they did, someone who wasn't afraid to take them on. As the day wore on, the tension in the city continued to build. The rally grew larger, with people from all walks of life joining in to demand justice. The news coverage was relentless, with every major network picking up the story. Social media was flooded with posts, videos, and hashtags, all calling for change. And through it all, Marcus worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, reviewing evidence, and preparing for the next steps. He knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that could define his career and his legacy. But he also knew that the stakes were high. The forces arrayed against him were powerful, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. Evelyn, meanwhile, was grappling with her own emotions. She had always been a woman of faith, someone who believed in the power of love and forgiveness. But as she watched the news coverage, as she listened to the stories of others who had been treated unfairly, she felt a surge of anger that she couldn't quite shake. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were. And she knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be setbacks and challenges. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had her son, her community, and the strength of her convictions. And that was enough to keep her going. As night fell, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The rally continued, the crowd growing larger and more determined. The police union was preparing its response, ready to defend its members at all costs. And Marcus was working late into the night, reviewing files and preparing for the battle ahead. The tension was palpable, a thick, heavy weight that seemed to press down on everyone. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when things would finally begin to change. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, a breaking news alert flashed across the screens. A video had surfaced, a video that showed the entire incident from start to finish. It was raw, unfiltered, and damning. The footage showed Officer Daniels approaching Evelyn's car, his tone aggressive from the very beginning. It showed him dismissing her explanations, his voice growing louder and more confrontational. And it showed the moment when Evelyn made the call to her son, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. The video spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and demands for justice. It was the evidence that Marcus had been waiting for, the proof that would make it impossible for anyone to deny what had happened. But even as the video circulated, the forces arrayed against Marcus were preparing their counterattack. The police union released a statement defending Officer Daniels and accusing Marcus of using his position to push a personal agenda. They called for calm, for unity, but their words rang hollow in the face of the video. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. As the city braced for what was to come, Marcus and Evelyn stood together, watching the news coverage with a mix of hope and determination. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be challenges and setbacks, but they also knew that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for justice, for accountability, for a better future. And as they stood there side by side, they knew that they were ready to face whatever came next. But what that would be, no one could say. The climax was coming, and the city and the nation was holding its breath.